Hello. Is this working? Oh, nice. Thank you for coming out on this beautiful day. It's so nice to see you. Lots of familiar faces. Thanks for coming out. I'm Katie Giha. I am the director of Tandem Press. And for those of you who may not know or be familiar with Tandem, we are a fine art print studio that was founded nearly 40 years ago by William Wiege, a professor of printmaking at the University of Wisconsin. We invite leading contemporary artists to the studio to work with our collaborative printmakers to create limited edition prints in our studio. And this evening, I'm very pleased to welcome one such artist to the stage, Sable Elyse Smith. And she came to the studio this past June for 5 days to work on a print. And then also, I'd love to introduce Patrick Smyczek. Am I saying that right? I meant to ask you before.
Smyczek.
Smyczek, got it. One of our collaborative printmakers who work closely with Sable at Tandem. Patrick has been making prints for over 20 years. He holds a BFA from the Maryland Institute College of Art and an MFA from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, with additional studies at the Academy of Fine Arts and Wroclaw and the Tamarind Institute. Patrick joined Tandem Press in 2007 and became a collaborative printer in 2019. He's also run his own print studio and taught at the University of Wisconsin Parkside. His work spans lithography, intaglio, relief, and screen printing. Just last week, Patrick was awarded the University Staff Distinguished Achievement Award for his excellence in printmaking and contribution to the School of Education. Sable Elyse Smith is a truly multidisciplinary artist. She works in painting, sculpture, video, text. Recently, she staged an opera at the Museum of Modern Art. And now we can also include printmaking to that list, although she also was doing printmaking before that, but more printmaking. While working in a variety of modes and materials, she consistently and incisively interrogates themes that are familiar and often insidious. Time, the carceral state, surveillance, and the everyday violence embedded in the systems and structures that shape our lives. In this way, Sable's modes of making become a kind of text, one that renders visible the conditions we inhabit. Her work resonates with Christina Sharp's essay, The Weather, which Sable has referenced in the past, and that appears in Sharp's groundbreaking book, In the Wake on Blackness and Being. Sharp writes, "In the weather of the wake, one cannot trust, support, or condone the state's application of something they call justice, but one can only hold one's breath for so long." It feels appropriate then to say that Sable's work takes seriously Sharp's question, quote, "What are the words and forms for the ways in which we must continue to think and imagine laterally across a series of relations in the hold, in multiple Black everydays of the wake?" Sable Elyse Smith's work has been featured in the Whitney Biennial, the Venice Biennale, as well as at MoMA PS1, the New Museum, the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Guggenheim Museum, the Institute of Contemporary Art Boston, and she just opened a solo exhibition last week at the Austin Contemporary, which was part of the Suzanne Deal Booth Flag Art Foundation Prize. Other awards include, but are not limited to, the Joan Mitchell Foundation, Creative Capital, and Louis Comfort Tiffany Foundation. She was recently included on the Time 100 Next, the magazine's annual list of 100 individuals who are shaping the future of their fields and defining the next generation of leadership. Please welcome Patrick and Sable. So tonight we're going to largely be concentrating on the collaboration between printer and artist and Patrick and Sable. I think it's a unique kind of collaboration that happens primarily, I think, in print studios in terms of printmaking. Sable, when I first approached you about making a print at Tandem, you responded that you had just recently been actually thinking about making a print, and it was funny that I reached out to you. I was wondering if you could start by telling us a little bit about what drew you to printmaking at this particular moment, and then Patrick, what was it like to begin this collaboration together?
Yeah. So I guess, well, specifically screen printing has had a real presence in my practice for a while, especially in relationship to this series of paintings that I've been making. But in that context, I would say the idea and the sort of application of printmaking was sort of more subordinate, right? It was like latent, and I was using it maybe as this kind of more simplistic quotation to think about, print media, mass distribution, right? The kind of scale of access that an item or sort of text might have and what its reach was. And then I also was using it through this kind of like conceptual lens of painting to think about a ground, right? So it was the printmaking process, the screen print was the base, and then everything I applied to it sort of started to build up this complex idea of what a painting could be. And so, I say it felt like, there are many complexities to how those works sort of start to exist, but I was using maybe the bare minimal kind of potential of printmaking in those works. So I had been thinking about it a lot and like what kind of information it could hold. But then more recently, and as I had been sort of working on that project for maybe 10 years, right, then I became more interested in kind of forefronting all the aesthetic possibilities of mark making, right? Because printmaking is sort of very complex and all these very sort of degrees of impression and mark and erasures and all these kind of pictorial possibilities, which is ways that I hadn't used it in my own practice, right? Maybe kind of fooling around in the studio and in educational settings, but never in my own practice. And that became kind of, I guess there was an urgency of that arrived. Also to think about pushing the innovation of like how I was using it and what those works could be moving forward too.
And from the standpoint of the printers and the collaboration in the studio, once we found out that we were going to be working with Sable, we like we do with every collaboration with a new artist, we as printers get together and look as much work as we can. We took a trip to New York to visit Sable in her studio and really just try to like do as much as we can before the visit so that we'd have a successful visit. In that we have 5 days. We knew we had 5 days to get as much done as we could and to make it a successful print. So leading up to that visit, we did a lot of different tests with different materials. We were in conversation with Sable. She sent some images. And so when, day one started, there was already things on the wall and things for Sable to look at. And having a starting point like that really allowed us to go in various directions and really just see what the possibilities were. And from there, all sorts of things opened up.
I just wanted to also say that we have several images rotating behind us, and the 2 images that have captions, those are the prints that we made with Sable. Printmaking at Tandem is incredibly collaborative. It's about working with an artist, meeting an artist at where they're at, also helping to sort of translate an artist's work into print media. Can you both talk a little bit about how your dynamic unfolded in the studio? Where did your roles intersect and maybe how did they change?
I don't know. That's a good question because I feel like, and I don't know if this is just the nature of this collaboration specifically, like there were no sort of distinctions in roles. I felt like the thing that was kind of surprising to me and surprising in, I guess, the sort of quickness or the speed in which it developed is that I felt like in the studio, somehow we were able to have a very sort of specific shorthand, right, that was inside the language of my practice, right? And so I just met Patrick for the first time through this project and like, I could show him some of my work and we talked about it a little bit, but this is a practice that has been multiple decades. So there's no way to kind of download and translate all of that information. And yet somehow once we arrived to the studio, there was a kind of quick way in which we were sort of working in sync, which I found surprising and shocking. I'm just like, how do you get it in a way? But I think that was the sort of beauty of the collaboration and also why we were able to sort of push such an ambitious and incredibly, incredibly complex project. And it might sort of seem simple, but there's like all these sort of processes and labor that went into achieving this very specific kind of image. So yeah, I don't know how to, I don't know about the distinctions, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, we've talked about this, and the 5 days was sort of a blur in a way, but it also didn't feel necessarily like we were rushing. We were, making all these deliberate choices, and we have a really great team of printers and students that work at Tandem as well, and everyone, just locks in that, 5 days, and it's okay if something doesn't turn out exactly how you had hoped, and you were really generous with the way you approached the project and really trusting in us to give you something that you were looking for. So it's like, if you're disappointed but you don't want to necessarily say it, it's like I could sort of see it of like, okay, we can get more, we can try something different. And we were just like making a lot of changes just like right on the fly. And every time we have a new collaboration or do a new project, even if it's with an artist that we've worked with a lot in the past, it's like you're not following a formula necessarily. You're making something from scratch, from an idea. And when you're kind of going down a path that you don't necessarily know where you're heading, all sorts of interesting avenues can open up. And that's really what happened with this project.
I mean, I guess I would say, like, for a metaphor, right? Like, if we think in the musical context, right, it was definitely like improvising, right? We knew what the rhythm was and maybe the kind of time, and we all can move in and out of that, bringing our own kind of like knowledge or expertise or like vision, and then that would create another kind of riff that then moved the project forward. So we kept kind of maybe moving the goalpost in different ways that resulted in this print.
Was there anything in that process that, I mean, it sounds like there were a lot of surprises, but was there like a fulcrum or a turning point where you were like, wait, okay, now we're in it. Now we have it. Let's go.
Well, I mean, at what point did we know that this was going to be woven, be a woven, like two prints coming together? That was something I've been thinking about, is like, we were working on multiple things, and then you had just come out of this residency, and it was maybe a couple days in that just sort of came about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Also, when I arrived, I did not think we would come to an actual print right by the end of the week. I'm like, it's 5 days also, and like, I met them a little bit. We hadn't worked together yet. And I didn't have like, okay, here is an idea that I just want to reproduce this image, because that's also not the point. But I brought some small reference works that I had just made at a residency in Florida, where I was doing actual paper weaving. And we started making 2 different test prints that were really focused on, how to translate my hand and the kind of like dexterity of painting, right? So how to get these sort of nuance in mark making and washes and building up color through printmaking processes. So we were kind of like testing that on 2 separate prints.
Right.
And then in the same time, Jason is in the background working his magic to kind of come up with this idea to like replicate this idea of an actual paper weaving. And then I think maybe it was like day 3. Once like we got some layers down and I could see that, there was like some efficacy in like the first print. I'm like, okay, this isn't just a throwaway print, right? Mm. There are ways that we can kind of like immediately adjust to make this into something that I think all of those things started to click and come together. But like every hour, something new was kind of innovated upon.
Yeah. I'd be like, oh, would you like that ink to be metallic?
Yes.
So Patrick, you've worked across lithography, intaglio, relief, and screen printing. How do you approach helping an artist translate their vision into the medium? And you've talked a little bit about that, but I know it's really important for you to meet the artist where they're at, and you make it seem so effortless. I wonder if you could like talk a little bit about that process for you.
Yeah, I think, when we're as collaborative printers thinking about a project, whether it be, before the artist comes or with the artist there, we just sort of, put out a bunch of different tests or show a bunch of examples of things where we think the artist might be interested in this type of mark making or this, type of printmaking that we do. With Sable, I think it was pretty clear, to everyone that if we were going to do a lot of color in 5 days and be able to create something that was really looking painterly or washy, the screen print was going to be the most efficient way to get something that Sable would be really happy with. And Sable had done screen printing or, actively does work with screen printing. So a process that Sable's familiar with. So there was a lot of things kind of like narrowing it down in that direction. But a lot of times it's really, we're very fortunate at Tandem Press that we have a lot of different techniques, more techniques than most printmaking studios within our studio. So when an artist comes and we can, show all these examples of different types of marks and different types of impressions that we can make, and you could get really excited about something and the artist is just like, not for me. And that's fine, because we just have a lot of different ways of doing things. So for us, doing a 41 color print or 220 color prints and putting them together into one print, it was really the most efficient way for us to do it and have something look great. So
Can you talk a little bit about, I know you were thinking a little bit about how to incorporate Sable's hand into the print and sort of where you got the sort of idea then to do the washing and the different screens with that, the different Mylar.
So it's something that I've been, working on over the years, and to get screen print to like really look soft and washy and not so rigid and graphic. And there's a way of, thinning down black screen printing ink and, brushing it across Mylar or plastic that's textured. And because of that texture, when a screen is shot and light is exposed through that, it really diffuses the edges and all the marks. So when that's printed, you just get this really beautiful, soft, kind of velvety, impression. And when you build on that, you can really get a range of values. So that's something that, looking at your work and thinking about it, and experimenting in the past, just like, okay, let's take this further and see if this was something that would be interesting to you. And, credit to you. You, like, the first few that we didn't turn out so great. They were terrible, right?
Bad,
yeah.
not terrible.
They were learning moments. And, from there, it was just like such an evolution. So.
In the introduction, Sable, I spoke about your work as a kind of text, one that renders visible the often violent structures we inhabit. And I was wondering, especially when I approached this print in its woven, like, illusion, it constantly is kind of pushing me to try and make it legible, or to understand it, or to take it apart and then put it back together. And I was wondering how you think about legibility in your work, and what you want viewers to read, or maybe what you want to resist being read.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good question. And it also sort of relates to some of the things that Patrick was just describing right now about, like, the kind of the illusion of the wash, or the kind of softness, right, of the actual imprint that the process of screen printing sort of made on these prints. Mm-hmm. So I'll kind of maybe circle back to that. But I guess in general, my practice is really structural, and it's kind of looking at these different systems. And I'm sort of interested in either materials or sort of processes that hold a kind of inherent information in them that then I can use as a sort of quotation or to try to maybe question or even dispel our assumptions about that thing, right? Our assumptions about generics or like whatever the case may be. And in order to do that, right, one thing that I've definitely sort of paid a lot of attention to and it's used as a strategy in my work is a kind of attention to surface. And I mean that both like literally and metaphorically, right? So what's the treatment of the surface, right? Is there shine? Is there kind of an allure? Is there a seduction, right? Something that kind of draws the viewer in and also sets an expectation for what they're looking at. But once they sort of approach or start to decipher all the other information that's there, right, that assumption is completely destabilized. Literally the ground is sort of, taken from under them, right? There are other things at play. And so, that could be through, again, surface, through a kind of seduction. That could also be through these sort of different mechanisms of illusion, right? Visual illusion. So it could be optical, et cetera. And I think that's one reason that this kind of impression of this paper weaving became important to try to push and figure out a mechanism for, right? And then also, right, explode all the different areas where the quote unquote weaving is legible. And then when it becomes something else where you start to question, like, how is this thing actually made? Mm-hmm. And then if you question how it's made, then you start to ask questions about, okay, well, what is the image? What is the text? Or what are these other things, right? How is this mark made? It feels like a painting, but then it's become something else, or it's flat, or, I can't understand, right, the kind of tactility of it. And so, it became really rich that was both a process and a kind of metaphor and a kind of like conceptual logic that could sort of be present in all the different ways that we produce this thing, right? Also, some aspects of it were sort of laser cut out. So there also is this active action of erasure and like kind of carving out and dismantling that is sort of happening, and then the image sort of reappears through this other kind of I wouldn't call it a reconstruction process, right? It's something different, right? It's something altered. It's about the kind of change in the process of undoing and representing a thing to you.
Mm-hmm. Did you, Patrick, when it was sort of presented to you as a woven image, how do you approach that with an edition?
I will say Jason put a lot more thought into that than I did. And, I think it became pretty clear, that like early on that trying to weave two prints together versus using a laser cutter that we have and creating this sort of illusion of a weaving would open up a lot of different possibilities as far as what we were able to do, and also be really consistent and efficient. So there was a lot of things that kind of, led us in that direction. But I mean, we were talking about this earlier, like the amount of screen time that Jason put in on making it look the way it did. I mean, it was just, it's wild. Like, it's very convincing that it looks like a weaving, but it just like, there's moments where it's just like, you don't even know what you're looking at.
I think for me, like the process, then the way that it's so concomitant with the sort of concepts of your work in terms of what you were talking about with the, the erasure or the taking out, but then also the adding in is kind of poetic and kind of works in this way. Although it was, but at the same time, it's also very practical, right? We didn't want to have a student, or we didn't want someone in the studio having to weave. And then, of course, in addition, it'd be very difficult for all of those to be exact. So it's a very practical solution that also, I think, fed into the kind of concept of this ability or inability to read the image, which I really like.
Yeah.
Patrick, I'd like you to talk about, especially for the students who are in the room, like what brought you to a print studio? What brought you to this position in collaborating with these artists that we bring into the studio?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think really the innovation of Tandem was something that, and this goes back to, I think, 2005 maybe, when I was a student at the Maryland Institute College of Art. You weren't there, but
No, I wasn't.
we took a class trip up to New York to the IFPDA print fair at the Park Avenue Armory. And it was this annual trip. There wasn't a lot of us printmaking majors. Printmaking was something that I just fell in love with just because, I loved to do it and I didn't really know what the possibilities were. So it was a really great opportunity for students to see what professional studios and what, contemporary artists were making within print. So it was a really big deal to go up to New York and check out the IFPDA, and Tandem had a place within that. I feel like it was like right in the center, and there was all these wild Judy Pfaff prints, and I had never seen anything like it. And that for me is really what changed things. And it happened that, as I got more into printmaking, two of my professors had studied collaborative printing. So they really steered me in that direction to pursue a career and more education in collaborative printing. And after graduating, I volunteered at Tandem for a summer. And, it just felt like the right place. And having worked in other studios since Tandem, or, after that time, really made me realize how special of a place Tandem is. And, we were talking about this earlier. One of the things all the collaborative printers really pride ourselves on is, meeting the artists where they are as far as like their work, and making something that really feels like they came into our studio and they used our equipment and they made this work, because it really is just an extension of them. And being able to translate those ideas into the work that we make, and do prints that are really pushing boundaries of what printmaking can be, is just like one of the most exciting parts of the job.
Yeah. Sable, I know you've exhibited everywhere and continue to, but I wondered if you had thought about the unique capacity for circulation and multiplicity with these prints. Does that shift, your thinking in terms of audience or access, or the life of the work once it leaves the studio?
Yeah, I guess that's an important point. And I've showed a few places. But also, I guess like my kind of entry to, creativity, and then maybe the thing that we kind of can name as art, or the people that we name as artists, was this kind of roundabout path. And I think there are many things that could be art, and there are many ways where that can enter the public and be on quote unquote display. And so that always is something that's important to me. I've kind of found myself into this like more sort of specific position, and there are at least kind of places that we're kind of used to that are the exhibition context. But I'm always interested in finding ways that different types of materials, or different media, or different processes, or just different opportunities for things to move beyond these kind of finite and like often very limited spaces. Print is definitely an opportunity to do that. And so, yeah, I'm kind of excited by that. And I think there are many other modes that sort of exist in my practice too, that, are thinking about these kind of extensions. And I think simultaneity is something that's important, right? There's a kind of way that your work can sort of enter a public discourse, simultaneously can have all these different avenues and ways to access different types of audiences and be involved in, or sort of facilitate different types of conversations. I feel like it's the same thing with teaching too, which is why I kind of constantly do it, right? That's also a different way where the extension of my practice can have a different kind of life.
So do you feel like that kind of practice plays into maybe a reason why you're working so multidisciplinary, or just this sort of quest to kind of approach the audience in a variety of different ways through various media?
I mean, I think it definitely is something that drives maybe my curiosity to be open to and explore different types of things, or even maybe, I guess, tackle other types of formats. But I mean, I make many different things because that's just how my mind works, right? Like, I think that's also the thing that sort of is how I was drawn to art in the first place. It was kind of like a very elaborate kind of tactile, physical way of processing information. So I'm just doing it for myself, and then somehow I realized and was kind of steered into, oh, this is a space that other people sort of participate in too. And so, like my practice is sort of driven by the ideas and the concepts, and also, trying to figure out all of these ways to look at structures and then point out the thing that feels very illegible, right? Which is also not media, right? It's about invisibility. It's about ephemerality in a way, right? So there is no medium to be sort of rooted to and sort of fixated in from the vantage point at which I'm trying to sort of understand and explore the world, and then kind of represent that.
Yeah. In maybe a different way, Patrick, like you've always, at least as far as I know, you've been pretty steady with printmaking. And when did you know that was your media?
That's a great question. My first major was illustration, and then I found myself in the printmaking studio much, much more. And I think it was like one of my professors being like, I think this is your place, and, really coming to terms with like, yeah, I think so. And it took a long time to really figure out what that meant, but it's like in your young life, you just sort of go down a road and then it leads to something else, and you just kind of follow it, and then you're like, oh, I'm a collaborative printer at Tandem Press. I don't know. How did that happen? That's wild. But I mean, just having opportunities and, doing what you love. And, I'm very fortunate that I've, landed here, but I mean, we're in kind of a niche like area, and it just, I don't know. There's certain people at the precision and the patience and
the thinking, the reversal, the layers of color.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a certain kind of person.
Yeah.
And it's just like I love all parts of it, like the preparation that is just, I think a lot of people would probably find boring. Just like there's a lot of like cleaning up and setting up, and the printing itself can be like a whole day of doing just like one thing over and over again. I like that, and so.
I have one last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Looking back on the collaboration, what feels most generative or important that you'll carry into your future work?
I know. I don't know. This is a hard one. I mean, I would love to just make prints nonstop at Tandem, especially with Patrick and Jason. Like it was very mind blowing, right? How the process sort of developed. And I've been thinking about this a lot. And I feel like, I think it's hard to know in this image, but the print that we made is super ambitious. And for it to be this ambitious and also this well executed, right? It feels very complex, and like it feels like something that's been cooked for like, I don't know, at least 6 months, right? But I feel like day 3 in the studio, that's where things really started to click for us, and then we were sort of accelerated. And then also like at day 3, like I took a notebook and I like feel like I wrote notes. I filled up my full notebook, like every sort of hour we would be discussing something else would be sort of revealed. And I just had like this flood of ideas for other prints or like experiments and tests that I wanted to make. And I knew we were kind of like getting towards this one. And I still didn't know that we would like finally lock into something, but it also feels like just the kind of beginning of a learning curve that already was kind of like there already was some kind of fluency in the way that we were working. So I feel like, there is so much more that it's even sort of untapped from just this one visit and what we sort of produced.
Yeah, and remember, like, day 3, you were having lunch and you both were like, okay, we got to go back. Like, you ate really fast and then you were like back in the studio. What were you, hair drying the puff paint?
Yeah, it was pretty wild. For me, there's, coming out of a visit and a collaboration, there's just things that happen that, often that you've never done that kind of printing. Like, you've done screen printing, but you've never, used this puff additive in an edition before, for instance. And,
Can you tell them what the puff additive
yeah, so
is?
in this particular print that we made with Sable, we incorporated this additive to our acrylic ink, and when it reaches a high temperature, it starts to expand and get puffed out, and it has like a really velvety texture to it. And so that was something I showed Sable a few days into the collaboration, because I was showing Sable everything. It was like, this is everything we got. And you're like, oh, that's really interesting. And then it marinated, and I mean, it ended up, being used. And, we had all these different prints. Like, we would like try something, be like, okay, that's not working. On the next one, do this. And so, that was something that ended up making it into the final print. But, there was things that we did that didn't. And, so, getting back to like what I take away from this experience is like, it was a great week. I absolutely loved working with you. And, the things that, the collaborative printers, Joe and Jason and myself, like, took away from, the processes, it was like, we took things that we had, experimented a little on in the past, and like really like took it a lot further, and just gained a lot more knowledge in, corners of printmaking that we'd never really like explored so deeply. So I think in that way, it was just like really, really like a thrilling experience, and really exciting, because, it's just, we do so many different things. And I mean, this project was, there's a lot in there.
In a short period of time.
In a short period of time. Yeah.
Awesome. I'd like to open it up to the audience if you have any questions. I think Barrett is there with a microphone, which shouldn't scare you. It's kind of fun.
When you were working at Tandem, did you decide on the color palette before you designed the scenery, or did you design the scenery and that influenced what color palette you used?
Oh, that's a good question. I brought like at least 6 references of works that I had made from that residency that I just sort of came off of over the summer, which is where I was experimenting with the paper weaving. So it was like a really nice kind of like index or like cheat sheet on thinking about the kind of the interactions of the two illusions, right? So and then how I wanted to kind of build up color too, which is like, that also was a learning curve. Like, I had to get back into the language of screen printing, right? Because I'm typically making these works with oil sticks, and also some of the smaller works that I was experimenting with, I was using watercolor, right? Which is, if you want to make a color, if you want to make a mark, that's quite immediate. And you have all of this sort of versatility to build up, to blend, to think about like the kind of color relationships. Whereas, you have to be pretty methodical to think about even the order that you're laying down color in in screen printing, and obviously other print processes. So, that took some negotiation. I think it was really helpful that I had basically these kind of indexes, and I knew a kind of color language and world that I wanted to work in too, which was like highly saturated and like incredibly bold, and also very loud, and like also playing around with the kind of subtleties of metallics to then like create all of these different nuanced moments across the print. Like, I think one thing that's interesting to me is like, it is an edition, right? So it is all the same, but I feel like looking at it, like every time you sort of come back to it, something new maybe it takes the focus, or your eye is moved around the print in different ways where it can feel new in a way. And I think thinking about the color and all the other things that were sort of at play here, that was one thing that I wanted to try to figure out, like, how do I maintain all of that nuance, even though we're making this edition that will be the same image across a spread.
And I think in terms of the image, like the fence was pretty important to you.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Patrick, what was the mixing of color like for you?
I love color. Big fan of color
I know
over
you
here.
are.
Great.
Yeah. So, I mean, when an artist like Sable comes in and wants to just go all out on color, like, I'm all for it. Like, and it was built in a way where, or this print sort of came about in a way where, we had these like kind of backgrounds that we printed. We printed like 12, images that we kind of built everything on top of, and that was to kind of mimic like old like line rule paper with like a key image on it, and then things kind of got added to that. And when Sable was making these films, it wasn't like all the colors were like conceived and the films were made all like together. It was done like really slow painting.
Mm-hmm.
So like we would print the red or the yellow that this film was to represent, and we would print the color. You'd look at it and be like, yeah, that works. And and then you would respond to that. You'd lay another like film over and then paint in thinned black ink, and try to imagine okay, based on what you just did, how's that going to translate to this now? Make it a little bit like more opaque now or something like that. And so, it was actually, I thought, a really good flow of, you're working on a film, and then you'd maybe like show me like a tiny little piece of color somewhere, and I'd be like, yeah, I got you. And I would go mix it and, do a test, and, everyone was sort of like working on their own thing. And, but yeah, I mean, there was a lot of colors in the end. So
is it 41 colors?
41
or 42?
41.
41.
Yeah.
I
went through my notes and counted them all, and I was like, oh yeah, 41.
Okay.
Feels like 41.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you've had like experience collaborating in the past, and like how this is kind of different from that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I've had a lot of experience collaborating in the past. I think as Katie pointed out in the introduction, I recently made an opera, which is a huge kind of monumental affair. I mean, I'm like, I don't know if I could actually count off the top of my head, but I think there were at least in total, even thinking about all the different sort of tech support and the curators at the institution, there were probably 40 different people involved in that collaboration. I've made other kind of more, what you would call maybe social practice collaborative projects that had this kind of pedagogical arm. I've made some video work in collaboration before. And then I think it's in this image, there's a series of neon works and these like really large scale sculptures that I've made, right, working directly with fabricators. But like those collaborations are slightly different. I think this one, I mean, the opera is a kind of another animal that we can't talk. It takes too long to kind of talk about all the sort of nuances of that. But there's like there's an intimacy in this collaboration, right? Mm-hmm. Like it was, for me, like very equal, right? I arrived with the kind of ground, right? The thing that I'm sort of describing in the beginning, like there is this base outline image, and that's kind of a prompt, right? It's not about recreating that image or making that something that's sort of aesthetically beautiful. It's about using this as an anchor to shatter it, right? So I arrived with that. I arrived with my index and this like sort of absurd idea to create this basically kind of like faux, like childhood, primary school kind of paper, right? So we printed that. And then everything that happened after that was literally through like kind of close observation, conversation with like the other people sort of in the building too, and like a respect for everybody's kind of knowledge and them understanding, right? Like at least some of the sort of main concerns of what I wanted to achieve, right? But we figured out together how to get there. And so I think that makes it very different and like specific, and also just like kind of happenstance that it happened like that. Like I didn't know what would happen sort of walking into the space, you know, trying to figure out a flow with strangers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So lucky.
Yeah.
I'm gonna
Patrick's
bring
my
the
best
mic
friend
back
though.
It's true.
You had said that you were taking notes throughout the process and want to make more prints in the future. I was curious if there's any like methods or techniques that really excited you or interested you that you weren't able to get to with this print, but might want
I
to.
was like, you want to know my notes?
No, I do want to know your.
No, that's a good question. I mean, it's not exactly like, oh, like there was this crazy technique that I didn't get to yet. It's just like kind of breaking down and like making reflections about everything that was discovered from even sometimes small alterations that we made, right? And so like one color could drastically change, I mean, not could, would drastically change the effect, right? The kind of illusion, the presence of the thing. So, right, like I think just really diving into the nuance of all those possibilities and like having also just even more time to kind of sit with some of those decisions. And again, I'm like incredibly proud and sort of excited about the thing that we made. But I just think, you know, there's so much that can happen in like another round, or even like thinking about how scale shifts, right? The color choices, like there are just like a million things kind of like floating in my mind that I had to kind of just keep track of. And also maybe there are ways that I can take it back into my other practice though that might be boring, like, and I'm kind of obsessed with. I mean, their studio is so efficient too, so it's like that I was also coveting. I'm like, oh, if I had this studio and I could do this every day, like it would be wild, right?
I mean, it was really, you know, an immersive experience.
Yeah.
And so I would imagine you would need some time to reflect after.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing great, Barrett.
Hey, thanks.
Oh, yeah?
I have a question for Katie. So how do you match, or at Tandem, how do you match the artist with a printer? Or do you?
I don't. They come in and, I mean, I think, you know, for this purposes of this conversation, we just included Patrick, but, you know, Jason up there also worked really closely. I think it kind of just, I mean, maybe you could answer that question better because I'm not doing any matching. I'm just throwing them in.
But I think the matching is picking the artist,
Yes.
right? You are inviting who comes.
Yes.
It's not an open door.
Yes,
so
that's true. That's true. That's true. But I wonder, I mean, Patrick, or I'm sorry, yeah, do you like, are you guys divvying things up, or are you sort of like, oh, this is probably screen print, so I'll take some of this on, and then Jason's like, well, I can figure out Illustrator and what needs to get cut. And I mean, that's kind of how I imagine it's happening, but
Yeah.
I'm not in there. I'm sometimes I tiptoe in and I'm like, what's happening? But I try not to like muddy up the process.
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's, you know, Jason, Joe, and myself have worked together long enough to where we just like know what to do and to support each other and to make things like, because we all wear a lot of different hats in the studio, so we are all able to do a lot of different things.
Right.
And we also know what's going to be the most efficient way to do something, just having done it for years together. So it's never really like we sort it out in like this conversation or something. It just sort of like, okay, this needs to be done, and then someone just does it. And you know, there's definitely times where we're like, okay, we communicate, so we're all on the same page about things, but you know, we all just like want to do our best job to be as efficient as possible and supporting each other and making the thing as great as it can be. And so, I don't know if that's a good answer or not, but
I mean,
it's just
I
sort of
think
like
part of the process that we didn't talk about, and I don't think we have really an image of it, is there is this like constant sort of proofing that's going on. So you guys are hanging something up on the wall, and you with the artist are kind of discussing what that proof looks like or what needs to be changed or what's the next step. So there is this like, I feel like there's a lot of communication happening between the printers and the artist.
With the artist, the printers are collaborating with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. So she was just saying that the printers are collaborating with one another as well. I think that Jason made a nice metaphor once when he talked about you guys being kind of session players, and that you all can play like different instruments, but you can also like jump in on other instruments, and there's this sort of harmony within that.
And then when the lead singer comes,
Yeah.
we'll be whatever band you want us to be.
There was another question here.
Sable, in your practice, what is artificial intelligence doing to the artist right now? Are you using that as a tool, or is
No.
that something you think will be bad? in your
Very
practice?
bad. I'm not using AI. I'm also not a tech person, really. Like the extent of how technology shows up in my practice is just through video production and editing. Like that, I feel very proficient at. I'm kind of a whiz as far as that technology, and then I put my computer away. Yeah, no place.
Patrick, do you see that in printmaking at all? It's a tool that might help you.
Oh, that's interesting. I feel like the big push with AI and tech has maybe not come to printmaking yet. But yeah, I mean, it very well could. I think, this idea of technology, like new technology in traditional printmaking methods, has always been like a part of my life and a lot of printers that have come before me, in that like, oh, this is going to like put you out of work, or this is going to like change everything. And really what it's done as just kind of, digital printing or inkjet printing, like really, really high resolution, high saturation, printing that like, comes out of a, printer in our studio or and we've used, these new technologies like laser cutting, or I don't know, there's a lot of different things that we've done. And it's just sort of like, it might be a piece of something that makes something more efficient down the road. I mean, I don't know how it's something we would use like at the moment, but it's an evolution, I guess.
I mean, and I'm not from your vantage point, so, I might not be looking at the same lens, but I guess, if we kind of reduce it, artificial intelligence is almost about a kind of, or the conversation around it is about an automation, right? Like, so taking processes away where they can become efficient and be done on their own. And I feel like printmaking is so much about touch. It's about the hand. It's about finding a tool that extends the possibility of what the hand does, So, but the hand is always in it in a way.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But that's my kind of
No, that's what I was
perspective of it.
That's what I was going to say too, because I feel like what Tandem does great is we're also innovative, but kind of at the end of the day, it's still like one of you guys cranking the roll.
Yeah, it's a handmade thing.
Yeah,
It
there's
feels
still your
like a
hand is
special,
there. Yeah.
like object or thing.
Yeah. Do you have a question, John? Well, this will be our last question. It's perfect. This is perfect timing.
So I know there are a few good printmakers in New York, and probably somewhere in flyover country between there and here. So
I told them no.
Why Tandem? Why Tandem? And would you recommend it to other colleagues?
Yeah, I mean, I would recommend them to everybody. Although then I'm kind of like, do I want everybody? Like, then that's free. That adds their schedule, and I can't get back in. I mean, I would say like specifically, I think my introduction was through Katie, and so Katie had worked at another institution previously, and I guess for at least 2 years we had been talking about trying to do a project together that was very different than this, right? A different scope, and we had met a lot, so we had spent a lot of time together, and just like there were so many crazy things happening in my schedule that just like we could never align our calendars. But I really wanted to work with her. And so when she got this job, I don't know when it happened in the timeline, but she contacted me and was like, okay, I'm not at this place anymore, but I'm here. Do you want to come here? And also, this was a kind of easier engagement in time commitment, but also something that was sort of important to me. So part of it, and, sort of looked up the studio. And yes, definitely aware of a lot of other printmaking studios and some other people. I currently teach at Columbia University, and we have a printmaking studio there. And the guy who runs it has constantly been asking me to do a print. And I was like, nope, I just did one with Tandem. So part of it was the strength of the relationship, right, that we had been cultivating. And I knew that she understood the practice. She understood my concerns and respected that. So I felt like, okay, doing a project would make sense. There would be a kind of intention and care in that. And then now that I've had the experience, I would definitely come back a million times over and recommend tons of people.
On that note, thank you all so much for coming, and thank you to Sable and Patrick.
Thank you.
And thank you to Barrett and the Chazen for hosting us.